The day my stepmom claimed I was just the maid's kid was the day I bought the entire estate. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming everything they said you could never be. Sometimes the person they dismissed as invisible holds all the cards. And sometimes the maid's daughter grows up to own the mansion. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. And let me tell you about the day I stopped being invisible. My name is Celeste Rivera. I am 32 years old and I live in Beacon Hill, though that wasn't always the case. For most of my life, I lived in the shadow of a sprawling colonial estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching through windows I wasn't supposed to look through, walking on marble floors I wasn't supposed to scuff, and listening to conversations about a future that apparently didn't include me. My mother, Carmen, had been the Whitmore family's housekeeper for 15 years when she died of cancer. I was 17 then, a ghost of a girl who knew every secret corner of Whitmore Manor, but had never been invited to sit at its dining room table. When my father, David Whitmore, married Victoria 6 months after my mother's funeral, I thought perhaps things would change. I thought grief might soften the rigid hierarchy that had defined my childhood. I was naive. Victoria Ashford Whitmore was everything my mother wasn't. Blonde, where Carmen had been dark. Commanding, where Carmen had been gentle. Born to wealth, where Carmen had earned every dollar through calloused hands and sleepless nights. Victoria moved through the world as if it owed her something, and perhaps it did. Her family had old money, the kind that built libraries and had streets named after them. She wore her privilege like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable. First year of their marriage, Victoria tolerated me with the cool politeness reserved for unwanted house guests. I was a reminder of David's past, a complication in her perfectly curated life. But as long as I remained invisible, studying quietly in the library's corner, eating dinner in the kitchen with the staff, coming and going through the entrance, we maintained an uneasy peace. That peace shattered on a Tuesday in March, during what should have been a routine family dinner. I had just returned from my sophomore year at NYU, where I was double majoring in finance and art history, on a combination of scholarships and the modest trust fund my mother had somehow managed to set aside. Victoria had insisted I join them for dinner to discuss my future, which should have been my first warning. Victoria never included me in anything unless it served her purposes. The dining room felt cavernous that night, the chandelier casting harsh shadows across the mahogany table that could seat 12, but held only 4. My father sat at the head, Victoria to his right, and their daughter Madison, my half-sister, beside her. I sat across from them, the empty chairs stretching behind me like silent witnesses. Madison was 19 then, a year younger than me, but infinitely more secure in her place at this table. She had Victoria's sharp features softened by youth, and David's easy charm that had once made my mother laugh until her sides ached. Everything about Madison was golden. Her hair, her skin, her future. She was set to inherit her trust fund on her 21st birthday, a sum that would make her independently wealthy before she could legally drink champagne at her own celebration. Celeste, Victoria began, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant business. Your father and I have been discussing your education. I set down my fork carefully. My education is going well, thank you. Dean's List again this semester. Yes, well. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. That's all very nice, but we need to be realistic about your future. David has been too generous, funding this hobby of yours? Hobby? The word felt like a slap. My degree isn't a hobby. What Victoria means, my father interjected quickly, his eyes not quite meeting mine, is that we think it might be time to consider more practical options. You're very bright, Celeste, but I'm not Madison, I finished quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison shifted uncomfortably, pushing food around her plate. She wasn't cruel, my half-sister, just thoughtlessly privileged in the way that money makes possible. This isn't about Madison, Victoria said, though. We all knew it was. This is about being realistic. You have certain limitations, financial limitations. You're not in the same position as Madison, and it's important to understand that. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I understand that I work 2 jobs to pay for what scholarships don't cover. I understand that I've never asked for anything beyond what my mother earned through 15 years of service to this family. Victoria's lips thinned. Your mother was compensated fairly for her work. But let's not pretend that what? I stood, my chair, scraping against the hardwood. That she wasn't family? That I'm not family? You're family, my father said weakly. But Victoria cut him off. You're David's daughter, of course. But you're also the maid's kid. Victoria's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never settle. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you need to understand your place. Madison has obligations, expectations, a certain standard to maintain. You have different paths available to you. The maid's kid. 20 years of living in this house, of calling this man father, of believing I belonged somewhere in this strange, cold family. And that's what I was. The maid's kid. I looked at my father, waiting for him to defend me. To remember that the maid had been his wife, that the maid's kid was his daughter. But David Whitmore had always been a weak man, and Victoria had learned exactly how to make his weakness work for her. I think, I said slowly, that I understand perfectly. Now, I excused myself with the kind of careful politeness my mother had taught me, the invisible girl's way of leaving a room without causing a scene. But as I climbed the servants' staircase to my small room in what had once been the staff quarters, I felt something crystallize inside me. Not rage. Rage was hot and temporary. This was colder, more patient, more dangerous. The maid's kid. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about my mother. Carmen Rivera had been more than a maid. She had been the heart of this house, the woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who knew exactly how David liked his coffee and which classical pieces calmed him when business stressed him. She had loved this place, and foolishly, I had thought that love extended to me. But love, I was learning, was different from belonging. Over the next few weeks, I watched my family with new eyes. I saw how Victoria orchestrated every interaction to reinforce the hierarchy she'd established. Madison's riding lessons, her cotillion preparations, her summer plans in the Hamptons, everything designed to cement her position as the heir apparent. Meanwhile, Victoria made sure I understood my place through 1,000 small cuts, suggesting I might be more comfortable eating in the kitchen, mentioning career paths that were more suitable for someone with my background, praising Madison's accomplishments while referring to mine as nice, dear. The breaking point came during Madison's 21st birthday party. Victoria had spared no expense. The ballroom glittered with crystal and candlelight, filled with Greenwich society's finest families. I had been invited, technically, but Victoria made it clear I was expected to help coordinate with the catering staff, to be useful rather than social. I wore a simple black dress, appropriate for staff, Victoria had noted approvingly, and spent the evening ensuring everything ran smoothly. I was refilling champagne flutes when I overheard Victoria talking to her sister Charlotte near the piano. "Madison looks beautiful tonight," Charlotte said. "And that trust fund, my God, Victoria, you've done well for yourself." 25 million, Victoria replied with satisfaction. David insisted on matching what he'd set aside for Celeste, though of course that will be redirected. My hand stilled on the champagne bottle. Redirected? Well, we can't have the maid's daughter sitting on that kind of money. David was sentimental when he set up that trust. Guilt over Carmen's death, I think. But Madison will need capital for her foundation work, her social obligations. It's better this way. The maid's daughter. My trust fund, the money my mother had somehow convinced my father to set aside, the safety net I'd never known existed, was being redirected to Madison. $25 million that had been meant for me, stolen as casually as Victoria might rearrange flowers. I finished, filling the champagne flute, and moved on to the next, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Around me, the party continued, all glittering dresses and polite laughter, while I learned that I had been robbed of more than just my place at the table. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the staff had cleaned up, I sat in my small room and made a plan. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about justice. It was about showing them exactly what the maid's kid could become. I had been invisible for so long that they had forgotten to watch me. They had no idea that I spent my summers interning at investment firms in the city, that my professors had been impressed enough to recommend me for accelerated graduate programs, that I had been quietly building a network of connections who saw my potential rather than my origins. They had no idea that the maid's daughter had been paying attention. The next morning, I transferred schools. Instead of returning to NYU, I enrolled at Columbia's graduate program in business, taking out loans that would have terrified my younger self. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Morningside Heights and threw myself into my studies with the kind of single-minded determination that my mother had once applied to keeping Whitmore Manor perfect. I disappeared from their lives so thoroughly that Victoria probably forgot I existed. For 5 years, I worked like someone possessed. I graduated summa cum laude, landed a position at a boutique investment firm, and began building the kind of wealth that old families like the Ashfords assumed could only be inherited. I was good at what I did, better than good. I had the hunger that comes from having nothing to fall back on, and the precision that comes from watching powerful people make their mistakes from the shadows. By the time I was 28, I had my own investment firm. By 30, I was managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. I cultivated an image of quiet competence, the kind of woman who wore understated designer suits and spoke softly because she knew people would lean in to listen. I also cultivated patience. The opportunity I had been waiting for came on a rain-soaked Thursday in November. My assistant knocked on my office door with a stack of documents and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ms. Rivera, there's something you need to see." The file she handed me contained financial records, tax documents, and legal papers that painted a picture of spectacular mismanagement. Victoria, it seemed, had been living beyond even their considerable means. David's construction company was hemorrhaging money due to a series of bad investments and cost overruns. They had been borrowing against the house, using Madison's trust fund as collateral, betting everything on deals that had fallen through. Whitmore Manor, the estate that had housed 4 generations of David's family, the place where my mother had polished silver and arranged flowers and raised a daughter who was never quite good enough, was going to be seized by the bank. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the following month. I closed the file and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking of my mother. Carmen Rivera had loved that house, had taken pride in every gleaming surface and perfectly arranged room. She had believed that love and hard work could earn a place in any family, even one that saw her as hired help. She had been wrong about the family, but she had been right about hard work. I attended the auction on a crisp December morning, arriving in a black Mercedes that whispered rather than announced wealth. I wore a charcoal wool coat and pearl earrings, the kind of understated elegance that money whispers rather than shouts. The auction was being held in the ballroom where Madison had celebrated her 21st birthday, where Victoria had casually stolen my future over champagne and canapes. The room was half empty. A handful of developers looking for a teardown opportunity, a few investors interested in the land, and in the back corner, my family. David looked older than his 58 years, his face gray with stress and defeat. Madison sat beside him, her golden confidence dimmed to brass. And Victoria still held her head high, still wore her privilege like armor, but I could see the cracks. They didn't notice me at first. Why would they? I was just another potential buyer in an expensive coat, someone they might have met at a charity gala and immediately forgotten. The auctioneer began the proceedings with the kind of professional sympathy reserved for fallen dynasties. The opening bid was set at $8 million, a fraction of what the estate was worth, but more than the family could raise. Do I hear $8 million? A developer in the front row raised his hand. $8 million. Do I hear 8.5? Another hand. The bidding climbed slowly. 9 million, 9.5, 10. With each increment, I watched my father's shoulders slump lower. This house had been in his family for over a century. His great-grandfather had built it. His grandfather had expanded it. His father had filled it with art and antiques that told the story of American prosperity. Now it was being sold to pay for Victoria's champagne tastes and poor judgment. When the bidding reached 15 million, most of the room had dropped out. Only 2 serious buyers remained: a development company that wanted to tear down the house and build luxury condos, and a private collector who saw the estate as a trophy. 15.5, the developer called. 16, countered the collector. 16.5. 17. I waited until the bidding stalled at 19 million, until the auctioneer was preparing to call it sold to the development company that would erase every trace of the Whitmore legacy. Then I raised my hand. 25 million. The room went silent. 25 million was more than the estate's current market value, more than anyone had expected to pay. It was the kind of bid that ended auctions immediately. It was also exactly the amount that had been stolen from my trust fund. The auctioneer looked stunned. Did you say 25 million, miss? Yes. My voice carried clearly across the ballroom where I had once served champagne while wearing a servant's black dress. $25 million. Any other bids? The auctioneer looked around hopefully, but the room remained silent. Going once. Going twice. Sold to the lady in the gray coat for $25 million. That was when Victoria looked back and saw me. I watched the recognition dawn on her face. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. She whispered something to David, and he turned too, his mouth falling open slightly. The maid's kid had just bought their house. I stayed for the paperwork, signing documents with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from having planned this moment for years. The estate would be mine within 30 days, pending the usual inspections and legal formalities. I handed over a cashier's check for the full amount. Money I had earned through years of 16-hour days, calculated risks, and the kind of ambition that comes from having nothing to lose. When I finally walked outside, they were waiting by the circular drive where David's Bentley sat like a monument to better times. Celeste. My father's voice cracked slightly. I don't understand. How did you... Hello, Dad. I stopped a careful distance away, close enough to see their faces clearly, but far enough to maintain the space that had always existed between us. Victoria. Madison. Madison looked like she might cry. She had never been unkind to me, just thoughtlessly privileged, and I could see that she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had just happened. Victoria, however, was made of sterner stuff. What exactly do you think you're doing? I'm buying a house, I said simply. It's a beautiful property. My mother always said it was the most beautiful house she'd ever seen. Your mother was what, Victoria? For the first time, my voice carried an edge. My mother was the woman who kept this house running for 15 years. The woman who raised me in the servants' quarters while dreaming I might someday have a place at the dining room table. The woman whose daughter you called the maid's kid, as if that were something to be ashamed of. Victoria's face flushed. You can't possibly afford $25 million? I smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. It's interesting that you mentioned that amount. It's exactly what my trust fund should have been worth. The trust fund you thought I didn't know about. The one you convinced my father to redirect to Madison. David made a sound like he'd been punched. I've done quite well for myself, actually. The maid's kid has been busy these past few years. I own an investment firm now, Rivera Capital Management. Perhaps you've heard of it? I could see from their faces that they had. My firm had been in the financial press quite a bit lately, praised for our innovative approach to wealth management. They just hadn't connected the Rivera and Rivera Capital to the invisible girl who used to eat dinner in the kitchen. So what happens now? Madison asked quietly. She had always been the most honest of them, and I respected that even if I couldn't forgive the advantages she'd taken for granted. Now I own your house, I said simply. Your childhood home. The place where 4 generations of Whitmores lived, and loved and built a legacy. I own all 37 rooms, the stables, the gardens, the guest house where my mother used to arrange flowers every morning before anyone else was awake. And Victoria's voice was sharp with anger, and something that might have been panic, and I'm going to live in it. I paused, letting that sink in. I'm going to sleep in the master bedroom. I'm going to eat at the dining room table that I was never quite good enough to join. I'm going to fill the library with books and the music, room with laughter, and the kitchen with the smell of the Puerto Rican dishes my mother used to make on her days off. I looked at each of them in turn. My father, who had never been strong enough to choose between love and convenience. My half-sister, who had inherited everything without understanding its value. And my stepmother, who had made sure I knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy she'd created. I'm going to turn the maid's quarters into my office, I continued. The place where I grew up thinking I didn't belong will become the place where I run a company that manages more money than your family has seen in 3 generations. Celeste. David started, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished. My voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the crisp winter air. I want you to know that I don't hate you. Any of you. Hate requires caring, and I stopped caring about your opinions of me a long time ago. But I want you to understand something. I looked directly at Victoria. You taught me that blood doesn't make family, that love isn't enough, that belonging has to be earned. You were right. I have earned my place now. I've earned it through work that you'll never understand, through sacrifices you've never had to make, through a kind of ambition that comes from having nothing to fall back on. The maid's kid, I continued, grew up to buy the mansion. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to prove that you were wrong about what I could become. Every time you dismissed me, every time you reminded me of my place, every time you made sure I knew I didn't belong, you made me stronger. I pulled my keys from my purse, the keys to the Mercedes, the keys to my Manhattan penthouse, and soon, the keys to Whitmore Manor. I'll be moving in after the holidays, I said. I'll need some time to redecorate, the servants' quarters especially. I'm thinking of turning my old room into a library, a memorial, you might say, to my mother and everything she taught me about dignity. I started toward my car, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Victoria? If you ever need a job, I'll probably need someone to help maintain the house. I hear you have experience managing estates. The pay won't be what you're used to, but I'm a fair employer. I learned that from watching my mother. I drove away without looking back, but I could see them in the rearview mirror. 3 figures standing in front of the house that was no longer theirs, trying to understand how the girl they had dismissed had quietly, systematically, built an empire large enough to buy their world. The next few months passed in a blur of renovation and restoration. I hired the best contractors, the most talented designers, but I made sure that every decision honored the house's history while making it truly mine. The servants' quarters became a beautiful office suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. My old tiny bedroom became a library filled with first editions and family photographs, pictures of my mother arranging flowers, pictures of her laughing with David before Victoria arrived. Pictures of a woman who had been so much more than the title they had reduced her to. The dining room was restored to its original grandeur, but I had the table expanded to seat 20. I wanted space for the family I was building, not through blood or marriage, but through the bonds of respect and genuine affection. My employees, my friends, the people who had seen my potential when others saw only limitations. I kept one room exactly as it had been, Madison's childhood bedroom. Not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder. She had grown up surrounded by beauty and privilege, assuming they were her birthright. I had grown up in the shadows, earning every opportunity. Both of us had been shaped by this house, but in very different ways. The first dinner party I hosted in my new home was everything Victoria's parties had never been. Warm, genuine, filled with laughter that came from joy rather than social obligation. I invited my team from Rivera Capital, my professors from Columbia, and a few clients who had become friends. We ate Puerto Rican food prepared by a chef who understood that the best meals tell stories about the people who share them. As I looked around the table at faces that reflected every color and background, at people who had earned their places through talent and hard work rather than inheritance, I thought about my mother. Carmen Rivera had believed that America was a place where anyone could build a life worth living. She had been right, even if she hadn't lived to see her daughter prove it. I learned later that David had found work with a construction company in Hartford, starting over at an age when most men are thinking about retirement. Madison had moved to New York and was working for a nonprofit, learning for the first time what it meant to earn rather than inherit. And Victoria had moved back to her family's estate in Newport, living off the remnants of old money while complaining to anyone who would listen about the ingratitude of stepchildren. They never contacted me directly, but I heard things. Through the small, gossipy world of Connecticut society, they told people I had stolen their house, that I had somehow cheated or manipulated my way into wealth. The story became legend in their circles. The maid's daughter who had gotten above herself, who had forgotten her place. They were right. About one thing. I had forgotten my place. The place they had assigned me was too small for who I had become. On a Sunday morning in spring, almost a year after the auction, I was working in the garden where my mother used to plant roses when I heard the sound of a car in the driveway. I looked up to see Madison getting out of a modest Honda, looking nervous but determined. She found me among the rose bushes, wearing jeans and gardening gloves, looking nothing like the polished executive who ran Rivera Capital Management. "The roses look beautiful," she said quietly. "Mom always loved them. Carmen loved them too," I replied, not looking up from the bush I was pruning. She taught me how to care for them. We worked in silence for a few minutes, Madison helping without being asked. Both of us lost in memories of two very different mothers who had shaped us in this same garden. "I'm sorry," Madison said finally. "For all of it. For not speaking up. For not seeing what was happening. For taking things that should have been shared." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. She had lost the golden confidence of her youth, but she had gained something more valuable. She looked like someone who had learned to see beyond her own reflection. "You were a child," I said. "Children don't choose the advantages they're given. But adults choose what to do with them," she replied, and I chose badly for a long time. I handed her a pair of pruning shears. It's never too late to choose. Differently. We spent the morning working together in the garden, two sisters separated by circumstances, but connected by the complicated love we both felt for the women who had raised us. When Madison left, she hugged me, the first time we had ever embraced as equals, rather than as the privileged daughter and the maid's kid. That evening, I sat in the library I had created in my old bedroom, surrounded by books and photographs, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something lasting. Through the window, I could see the garden where my mother had worked, where I had learned to be invisible, where I had first understood that belonging couldn't be given, had to be claimed. I thought about the girl I had been, eating dinner in the kitchen while dreaming of a place at the dining room table. I thought about the woman I had become, someone who had built her own table and chosen who would sit around it. I thought about my mother, who had died believing that love and hard work were enough, who had never known that her daughter would prove that sometimes they are. The maid's kid had grown up to own the mansion, but more than that, I had grown up to understand that the mansion was never what mattered. What mattered was the strength to build something beautiful from the pieces of a broken beginning, the wisdom to know that dignity cannot be given or taken away, and the grace to forgive the people who never understood your worth. I pulled out my laptop and began to type, sharing this story with the world, because I had learned something important in that journey from invisible girl to successful woman. There are others out there, other children eating dinner in kitchens while dreaming of dining rooms, other young women being told that their dreams are too big for their circumstances. I want them to know that the people who dismiss you are often the same people who underestimate you. And that can be the most powerful advantage of all. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. Sometimes the best response to being called just the maid's kid is to become someone so magnificently successful that they have to redefine what those words mean. And sometimes, the girl they overlook grows up to buy their world. If you've ever been underestimated because of where you came from, I want to hear your story. Share in the comments below how you proved them wrong, or how you're still working to prove them wrong. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone in this journey from invisible to unmistakable. Remember, they may have taught you that you didn't belong, but you get to decide where you belong now. The maid's daughter sends her love,